We continue our look at Edouard Manet. This is part 2 of the lecture. And I wanted to start with some images from the Franco-Prussian War from 1870. Again, when we look at this, you can kind of see the overall devastation that kind of occurs to Paris during the time of this war. And it makes good sense that a lot of artists either kind of flee Paris or immediately afterwards go to different places, aren't really in Paris proper. We know Claude Monet goes to England actually and returns after the conflict. We have Edouard Manet, playing a little limited role in the conflict, but afterwards we see him traveling as well. We know that he was out of town for the Paris Commune those 3 months, as I mentioned. And again, when you look down at the street, you can kind of see one of the barricades that they famously formed on these streets. We know that he was out of town for this time period. He wasn't directly in Paris, that his name was added to the list of folks that were a part of the Commune, but that he was never actually actively a part. I believe he was actually down south during this time period, but the important thing is he wasn't there specifically to witness the devastation and loss of life that was in the Paris Commune. But again, when we look at his work from this period, a lot of this has to do with the people he's associating with and the people he knows. This is actually a painting done by Edouard Degas showing Madame and Monsieur Manet. And this is a very famous picture, at least in my mind, because on the image on the right is actually what the painting looks like. But it's you see a lot of postcards or posters, if you will, of the image looking like this, where they've kind of cut off this wall that Degas had painted into the painting as a way of balancing out the extreme black that we see in Manet's suit. And it's also very interesting that we don't even see all of Madame Monet there. She's kind of peeking through, or the side there. Bert Morisot is another person we have in close connection with Edouard Manet. We know that the two kind of painted together. There wasn't ever any romantic relationship between these two. From my understanding, Bert Morisot was never left alone in a room with Manet. There was always somebody there, like a chaperone or that type of person. Oddly, she does go on to marry Edouard Manet's brother, Eugene Manet, who is an artist as well. Bert Morisot is a very successful artist. Again, she shows with the Impressionist, and again, it's kind of this connection that we have, where a lot of these kind of newer ideas that we see from Manet kind of get channeled through her, I think, in some regards. Again, this is kind of a separate period in my mind to the previous period. When we look at the previous period of Manet's life, he really is kind of devoted to the classical idea of what a painting is, of this construction within a studio. And when we look at this half of his life, paintings from Berck-sur-Mer, things of this nature, he's painting outside, and he's really adopting kind of a newer vocabulary. He's looking at work by the Impressionist, and in many cases working alongside the Impressionist, and really kind of honing this newer technique, if you will. On the Beach from 1873 is most likely his wife, Suzanne, and then we have this other figure who is most likely his brother-in-law. I believe this is the same gentleman that we saw in the Luncheon on the Grass painting, and we will see him several times during this period as we're working farther and farther away on the outside of Paris. But when we look at how this painting is constructed, again, it's becoming more and more loose in terms of the brushstroke itself, especially as we look off into the water. I always think that this is funny. Poor Madame Manet had to wear essentially this huge frock. It almost looks like she's wearing a tent. We kind of see the same thing here in this painting, Swallows. Again, I love paintings like this because you get an understanding of what people were wearing during their leisure time during this time period. And again, it doesn't look very leisurely to me. But again, when we look at painting like this, when we look at kind of how he's rendering the perspectives here and what he's actually painting, and even how he's simplifying some aspects of the composition, this is very different than the earlier Manet that we saw, where again the concept of realism was really the overshadowing aspect of his work, even to the point of showing realistic contemporary situations. A game of croquet, again, just a nice leisurely event. But if we look at how we're actually depicting the background here, the foliage seems to all kind of blend together into these wonderful green and bluish brush strokes meant to show the leaves. But again, this is really what we would think of as the impressionist side of Manet, and a lot of this is directly influenced by some of the people that he's working with and around, most notably Claude Monet, not to confuse two things that often get confused in terms of art history. But when we look at the paintings he's done, both are in Argenté, again, things like this, this is this time period where he's actually living right across the Seine River from Monet, and we also know that Renoir is living in the local area as well, and is frequenting and living very, very closely with the Monet family. So all of these different elements kind of come together. Here we have the brother-in-law one more time in a nice little striped shirt and in a cute little fishing hat, if you will. But again, when we look at the background and we look at how he's treating the water during this time period, we really do see the effects and, if you will, the direct influence of Monet. Boating is probably one of the more famous paintings that we have, again, from this time period. Once again, we have the brother-in-law. But when we look at this, this is a beautiful kind of transition piece for him. We have aspects of reality as we get closer to the canvas. But again, the impressionist love of water seems to always kind of dominate, and it seems such a wonderful excuse for these artists to just kind of play around with color and brushstroke and kind of hide it within the idea of flowing water itself. Again, when we look at this and we look at the ability that they're using to create this type of thing, we certainly get this sensation. Claude Monet, as I mentioned, was painting in Argenté at the same time. When we look at a painting like this one, Claude Monet in Horizonte, from 1874, this is almost confusable with a different artist altogether, maybe even a Monet painting. Again, this is where we can really see him, Manet, that is, fully kind of embracing this impressionistic style and really experimenting with it and trying to see what it will go and what it'll do. It's a good point to remember that in 1874 we do have the first Impressionist exhibition. So a lot of this work that we're seeing kind of leading into this is actually done before we have our first showing. Here we have another great example of him working in this impressionistic style, and we're looking at the back. I would imagine this to be Madame Monet and most likely their first child, who was also there at the time, and we see in multiple paintings, including one we'll see soon enough. But again, if you look at the dashes on the water itself, how he's using just these dashes of blue and white, again, incredibly uncharacteristic for what we would think of as his earlier work. This is really a different style altogether. And again, it's if you think about it and you think about how he's working, maybe he was just under the impression that this was kind of the newer thing and that this was what needed to be pursued. We, of course, have this very, very famous incident where we have him going and painting the Monet family one more time. That would be Claude Monet and his wife and their youngest son. And again, when we look at this, this is a famous portrait because we also know that Renoir shows up at the scene and sometime later and actually has to kind of borrow some art supplies. And the interesting thing about it is we actually have the two different artists, Manet and Renoir, both painting the exact same scene. And here we have Renoir's version of the painting, and it's again very, very different. You'll notice it's very flattened in the background. A lot of the colors he's kind of carried over into the people themselves. But when we look at the composition and how he's actually painting, again, especially the child, when we look at these very, very long brushstrokes that are created, again, he's even taking this idea of the Impressionist brushstroke even farther than Manet was doing during this time when he was kind of working around this group. Again, it's a very interesting moment in time because we see this wonderful comparison, if you will, between kind of the older generation of artists and this assimilation and kind of this viewpoint of what is occurring next. And again, when we think about the color usage just between the two, and we look at how on the left, again, Manet is using very realistic colors, while on the right, Renoir is synthesizing a bit and bringing out this very, very greenish, yellowish type of color for the floral, while we have the darker green tone present for what we think of as Manet's version of the painting. It's also interesting that we have Claude Monet in one of them, and of course he's not featured in the other, but we do have the two roosters in combination. Another portrait of Claude Monet at work, and again, this is just a reminder of kind of the extent of this period and really what's occurring with Manet. This is when he's kind of changing his vocabulary over because of these younger people that he's working with, these younger artists. And again, being outside of Paris proper, being outside of the city and working in plein air, which is something that we really don't see him working on prior to this period of art. All of this kind of the second wave or the Impressionist style that we see with Manet.